Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Kaya Schilde, the director of the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University and the Jean Monnet Professor of European Security and Defense. And I'm excited today to welcome everyone to a talk in the speaker series for the Jean Monnet Chair of European Security and Defense. Our theme is Europe and the World. And today we have Hanna Ojanen, who is the research director of the University of Tampere, Finland, and a senior research fellow in the Horizon 2020 project called ENGAGE, which is an acronym for Envisioning a New Governance Architecture for a Global Europe. And today she's going to be talking to us, which is a group of people who have come to see a center event. And also the students from my class are here, which is the Transatlantic and North Atlantic and European Security course at Boston University this semester. And Dr. Ojanen is giving a talk on the implications of NATO enlargement to Sweden and Finland. What changes have there been? And welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Schilde, for this invitation and for the introduction. I am really extremely happy to be able to take part and to talk to you and to talk with you about this topic that is so central, that has been so central for the whole year and continues to be very central. And I am very much looking forward to hearing from you, your thoughts, your take, or also the questions you might have on the topic. Before really starting, I would actually immediately turn to you. You were assigned a reading, a very short report. And it was a government report. And you might have wondered now, what is this? And what does it mean? What is the function of this report? It is very, very short. I didn't want to give you too much to read. You will get a list of readings at the end of my lecture if you want to read more. I was thinking that this could give you an idea of how the government of Finland communicates, what language it uses, and what it needs to get said, in a sense, in a very concise way. And I would actually like to start by asking your first reactions, really, one or two, about how you found this document. If you were in charge of NATO enlargement, would you take that kind of country in? Or were you perhaps surprised by something in the document? It would be really lovely to hear a voice or two to start with, like real first reactions. I think Professor Schilde will be looking for reactions here.
And I have also just posted the document in, it's loading. I've posted it in the chat to everyone who might be just logging on and who might not have had a chance to read it. The students have had a chance to read it. So we will just see if anyone can raise your hand, because we have the functionality to do that right now. Let me just monitor everything. So the question again for everyone, this is a little bit different than some of the speakers we've had, because I'm asking you to engage at the beginning for our speaker. So the question again, just to repeat it, is if you were NATO, what would you think about letting these countries in? The features of these countries, the history of these countries, the security interests of these countries, the other associations of these countries or other affiliations of these countries. You can also use the Q&A function. And if we don't get any right now, we'll come back to it. Okay.
Exactly.
Oh, so we have one hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Celine.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So from NATO perspective, actually, I would kind of concerned about the already very decentralized structure between NATO countries and cooperation, and on the other hand, further enlargement would impact NATO's both stability and its security, I'm afraid, because Finland and Sweden, both of them is sharing border with Russia. And there is another theoretical explanation for that. Those countries or entities sharing borders with other adversaries is more likely to get in conflict. So this is kind of what I think.
Thank you. Good point. Anyone else who would like to?
There is a Q&A, because we have multiple ways somebody can comment or contribute. One of the students, Cassidy, has said that in this thought experiment that you posed, she would be hesitant as NATO. What would countries offer in return? Because as Celine just mentioned, the risks, whether geographic or otherwise, are multiple.
Excellent. Is there perhaps a third hand up? We take that and then we move on.
So that's Tessa. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Tessa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I've never done webinar, but I was actually surprised. So I would also be worried about NATO enlargement because of, the current issue even, which is that, Finland shares a border with Russia and it's threatening to Russia, which brings like Article 5 issues up. But I was surprised at how large it seemed like Finland's defense budget was in this. I think for a lot of members, Finland, or like their defense budget, I think it says 1 to 1.5% of Finland's defense budget would go to the annual, like the direct cost of NATO membership. And I think for a lot of countries, that's a higher percentage of the defense budget. So it kind of surprises me, although it's not shocking given the shared border that Finland does have such a high defense budget. But I think because they're so militarily capable, it's less of a threat then, because even if Article 5 is invoked, or even if there is some issues on the border, they can defend themselves more than other countries can.
And I'm going to add one more or two more actually from students in the Q&A. Aaron has said that I think that Finland emphasizing the commitment to partnership for peace and its previous capacity for information sharing and security is a strong argument in favor of NATO to balance out those concerns. And then also another comment is that the borders of Russia could be a benefit to NATO. Having a country so contiguous to Russia is as much of a risk as an asset to a security organization that could potentially deter Russia from expansions, similar to the thought process historically behind Alaska in the United States. And that is a fascinating and great comment from a student to make the historical comparison. And then also Dia has said that while Finland itself may benefit NATO, and the document mentions Finland's defense planning process, it does risk escalation. So this is a really nice ground laying of the array of pros and cons, so to speak. Really,
very impressive. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from you then at the Q&A session. I would now like to go to my talk and see how we can bring in these excellent insights you had already and your assessments to the broader picture. And now classically, I try to share my screen, which is usually always what works well when you try. Oh, here we are. So, this is basically a short lecture about implications of NATO enlargements. And what I try to do is is to look at the implications from a couple of different angles. Implications for Finland and Sweden, implications for NATO, but also implications for European security. This is a bit of a speculation, as you can understand, because these countries are not members yet. So we are speaking about something that might happen. That happens, but we don't know about the consequences nor the timing. Anyway, we are in a good position to think about it and try to get a good overall picture of the situation where we are now. What I'm also going to add rather quickly is a couple of theoretical considerations for you to think about, to enlarge the discussion a bit, to how it can be interpreted and what it relates to when we think about our theoretical frameworks. And finally, I would suggest a lot of further reading for those who are interested. Anyway, now I have to find out here. This is where we start. We have two very, very serious persons here. This is a press conference in February, the day actually when Russia started its war of aggression on Ukraine. And the two very serious looking persons are the Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, and the President of the Republic, Sauli Niinistö. This is a press conference, and we have seen many of these this year, like really many. Here, you can understand the situation is really tense, and no one knows really what is going to happen. Both are wearing black. They look serious, as I said. They get difficult questions, it seems. And it's a very, very dramatic moment in a sense. It's there are a lot of unknowns. There is a big change in the making. Rapid, unexpected. Should one start speaking about NATO? What else should we speak about? If we speak about NATO, that leads to a permanent change, dramatic change. What about the adverse consequences that might follow? What would Russia do? How would it react? All this comes in all of a sudden, and these two figures, they certainly sense the weight of responsibility on their shoulders, which makes them look so serious too. They have been more sort of happier looking afterwards, and it only took like 3 months from this, less than 3 months, when we already had the short report you were reading and analyzing just a while ago. And that was already a very short and concise report, basically on why it is a good idea to join NATO. And it mentions how the security environment has changed, what Finland will get when it joins, what NATO's role is, how Finland will participate in decision making, how much it costs. One needs to be very pragmatic, what the obligations are, and how Finland actually meets the membership criteria, and so on and so forth. So a rather pragmatic, concise report about a decision that has been taken. And after this, a couple of days later, the actual membership applications were given to NATO in Brussels. Now, if we start to look at the implications and start from the point of view of what the implications are for Finland and Sweden and their security and defense policies. clearly, for both of these countries, the year has been dramatic and is still very dramatic. And they are in many ways in the similar situation, but they are not quite the same. And it is important to note some differences between them, and also some of the new dynamics in their bilateral relations that we have seen this year. Both two countries are heading towards a really very big change, because they're traditionally, their security and defense policy has been based on military non-alignment, and before that, neutrality. Now it will be time for alliance. It is also everything has happened really quickly, starting with a dramatic change in Finnish public opinion, followed by change in Finnish politicians' views that had immediate impact in Sweden as well, and changed the Swedish views, and meant that both countries actually rather quickly were taking the same steps in parallel. So one very important thing here is that these two countries are actually joining together, and they make this very big thing. They want to join at the same time. And why is that? They have very deep bilateral defense cooperation. And it wouldn't really make sense to have one of them in NATO and one outside. It would actually make it more complicated for them to cooperate. Their cooperation has really very deep and long roots in history, but it has been developing to a very remarkable extent after, say, 2014, the Crimea year. And now, if you look at the documents describing this cooperation, you see that it is a cooperation that is intended not only for times of peace, but also times of conflicts and crisis and war. It has no restrictions. It can basically cover whatever. It is not a formal defense alliance, though. But it covers all circumstances. It means in practice, for instance, that the defense forces have joint units, and they use each other's naval and air bases. They train together, they want to deploy together, and do some defense planning together, and take care of, for instance, the airspace and maritime space surveillance together. You see the spaces on the map, so that's understandable that they work together there. Now, in the background, perhaps two things that are important. One is that they are similar, they resemble one another, and the other thing is that they trust each other. And of course, here we might immediately stop and think about these notions. What comes first, trust or similarity? Whether they are similar because they have been cooperating for a long time, whether they trust each other because of the fact that they are so similar. These are really interesting questions, and it is something that is worthwhile thinking also once the two countries are in NATO. Like, what is the basis for really deep defense cooperation that goes as far as to enable specialization? That is, that you trust someone else for parts of your defense. You are not just cooperating, but you actually like outsource something. It requires a rather high level of trust. and interoperability, of course. So here you have a pair of countries with high degree of trust and a long, long tradition of cooperation. But at the same time, there are differences. I would say Sweden has been traditionally a bit quicker, so it has changed more often. It changed after the end of the Cold War towards more like expeditionary forces and crisis management, abolished conscription and so on. Finland always stayed the same. Territorial defense is the most important. There is obligatory conscription, and there is a large reserve that takes care of the defense. Now, Sweden is coming back to this kind of thinking about territorial defense. So in a sense, the countries are becoming more alike again. But there are other differences. If you think of defense industry, for instance, Sweden is one of the big players in Europe, not big, but like middle size at least. Finland is rather small. Similarities then certainly the way they joined the NATO structures in the 90s already, starting with the Partnership for Peace, then moving to enhanced opportunities, partners, deeper and deeper cooperation. And they also joined the European Union together in 1995. And that was also when they changed from neutrality to non-alignment. So basically a lot is in common, but you find also important differences between them. And now they want to join together. So before going to the larger European framework, one more word about the implications. There are two ways of seeing the implications. One way basically is to say that this is a huge change, but the other way is to say that, well, given that the countries are already so close to NATO and have been cooperating for a long while, the visible changes that you will note are not that much, actually. So we are like now between these two ways of seeing things. Huge policy change, but still on a practical level, could also be like noticing that, okay, we were actually as close to membership as one can be without being a member. And it is sometimes being said that these countries are even more interoperable with NATO than some other NATO member countries that I don't know, but this is something that we hear sometimes. So, big policy change, but actual technical way of looking at it, the consequences might not be that big. Are there then consequences for European security at large? I have here 2-3 questions that I will only mention quickly, and we can continue discussing these if you are interested. There is not only NATO in Europe, and so we might think that this enlargement has consequences also for the EU. The EU has been developing its security and defense policy to the extent that even the dear neighbor of Finland and Sweden, Denmark, decided finally to join that policy. It had an opt-out from the 90s already, didn't want to take part in security and defense, but now it has reconsidered, seeing that it is actually such an important field that it wants to be in it. So there is that development going on. There is development in EU-NATO relations that are also seen in different ways. Some see competition there, others see more cooperation. Many see a need for that cooperation in many questions, particularly hybrid threats, countering them, or organizing for military mobility. So in many ways, this is an important relationship. And NATO enlargement might have an impact on that or might not. But it is something that we will see. Also, a big question, perhaps, is what happens to non-alignment or neutrality in Europe? There are still 6 countries that are in this category. In some of them, already discussion going on as to whether they would need to reconsider. This is a very big question, like, what is the role of non-alignment, and why are they needed, or what are the reasons for being non-aligned in today's world? This is also a discussion that has come up because of the Finnish and Swedish decisions. But if we then look more closely at the implications for NATO, I have here some elements that I think you already mentioned when you were reading the reports. And again, there are several ways of looking at it, and several ways you can assess what the implications might be. Basically, we start from the fact that NATO will get 2 new members. Simple. Is that positive or negative? And here we start getting the different interpretations. Enlargement as such is always very, how to say, a mixed thing for an organization, if I can say so. It is really consequential. If you think of any international organization and think about the ways they take in new members, you would always notice that it is not a matter that is that just like takes place. Like someone is interested and you say, oh, welcome, and then that country joins the next day. No, usually the processes of enlargement are rather complicated, and it is also common, if not a rule, as a matter of fact, that enlargement is a decision where the old member states all want to have a say. So usually it is based on unanimity, because enlargement really is a risk. You never know who you are getting in. Like, you think you know, but who knows whether these new countries, whether they will have some new ideas next year about changing the organization. You have to be aware of many different things and go through different kinds of scenarios and be sure that the countries know what they are joining and know what is expected of them. So basically, understandable that enlargement is a long process, usually. If you think of how long it took for Poland or Estonia to join, it was years. That has been considered normal in a sense. And it has been, in the case of NATO, also years that have been used in order to make these countries their armed forces interoperable with NATO. So a lot of developments and renewal that has been taking place during these years. So usually long process, hesitance, old member states for good reasons. But here, really quick. And now we are short of only 2 ratifications of the membership 2 countries out of 30 that have not ratified yet. Why so quick? Well, first, because these 2 countries were already so compatible. They were well known. The NATO countries had already been training and exercising and going to operations with them. So it all was rather clear. Also quick because of the situation. War in Europe, need to show unity from the part of NATO, need to show that NATO is capable of acting quickly, of making decisions, of achieving, and what is perhaps most important of all, NATO had to show that its open doors policy is actually a true policy, and that Russia cannot have a say on whether NATO enlarges or not. So many reasons for having a really quick process. Plus the fact that these 2 countries would be contributors, or so to say, security providers and not consumers. And this is one of the most important parts actually of the whole process. The 2 countries showing that they actually are security like net providers. They can take care of their own security. They are not needing anyone's help for that. But on top of that, they can contribute to the strengthening of the alliance and thus the other countries' security. So all these together makes for the possibility of having a quick accession process, exceptionally quick. A couple of days of negotiations, actually, something they had to talk about. Seems like a good deal. NATO would get stronger. Defense capabilities, intelligence, the location of these 2 countries. But yes, as you noticed when you went through the reports, also considerations about the how the border between NATO and Russia gets much longer. It gets double as long as it used to be. And also then considerations about what it actually means that once the 2 are members, all 5 Nordic countries, that is Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, will be NATO members. Is that something that will have impact on NATO? Really, we don't know. But it would be understandable to have some concerns about the possibility that these 5 countries together, and perhaps opting for some other countries still from the alliance, might have the ability and the will to influence NATO's agenda, or to put more Nordic issues on it, and somehow bring the alliance more towards the north. This is normal in a sense, like everyone is concerned for one's own territory, but the size of this Nordic group is rather large. They are very able, and they are very good in cooperating with each other. So the Nordics have already met several times. The Nordic prime ministers say, we want to act together in NATO, but one shouldn't be worried. It won't be a block. It won't be a block that makes it impossible for NATO to decide something, or that sort of diverts attention, but rather a constructive group of countries that could have some issues that it would like to further. And one of these issues is resilience, societal resilience, or the ability to recover from crises and things like that. So perhaps a stronger Nordic voice, that might be an implication for NATO. Whether this also means that the situation will somehow change when it comes to other long-term issues on NATO's agenda, like NATO's role in the future, that remains to be seen. How much NATO will deal with issues like resilience and societal security, what will be the balance between territorial defense and operations out of area. These are big questions for the future, and the Nordic countries will have a voice there. They might have a common voice or then differences between them, but the balances might be changing. Now, this was the more or less the empirical part, in a sense, and the implications as far as we now can say, and in presented in a rather quick way. Now, I would like to go back shortly, or sort of open up another way of looking at the same thing from two more sort of theoretical lenses, using some theoretical lenses on this. And first, looking at all this from the point of view of what could be labeled as small state realism. I don't know whether this resonates, whether you have been reading on small state theory. It is dear to us here in the North because we are all small, and there are schools of thoughts and lots of research being done on small states in international affairs. Small state realism would be something of a kind of thinking where you think that, okay, being small means something. It means, for instance, that you don't have that many options. You can't do anything alone, and there are simply some realities that you can't change. Typically, small states would be leaning on others, on organizations, and being very multilateral in their policies. Finland and Sweden are good examples of this, because they find that small states are safest when they are embedded in organizations and in a rule-based order. Alone, they can't really do that much. Now, you could think that NATO then is an organization, so it fits well here. It might also be the only realistic thing to do. If you look at the reports, it said something about commitments and principles thus far, that they were not enough to prevent war. That was rather strongly put. So the consequence would be, okay, we need something more. What we have is NATO, so we now need to join NATO. That would be the credible security solution for a small state. And it gives the security guarantees that the other organizations wouldn't be able to give. Okay, but then you still need to maintain some integrity. You need to be able to show that, well, we still exist, and we actually are, and we decide for ourselves, even though we are small. So there is a strong identity component here, and a need to find some elements of continuity. You have to change, you have to take big decisions, but basically you are the same. So you make your sovereign decisions. It was our decision, not anyone else's. You calculate costs and benefits, and you come out with an end result that is positive. And you note that you actually gain some things through this. You gain more participation in decision making in NATO. Important thing. So you show that you are in control and it was your decision, and this was the wise thing to do, and you continue more or less the same, in the sense your identity has not been changed. I think this is an important thing to add. Another and final interpretation would be that when a big change happens, we see interesting things happening when it comes to the way we speak about it or the discourse. So we need to fix the discourse somewhat. And I think this year has been very interesting, not only in the sense that we find new ways of speaking about certain things, but at the same time, we also understand that the old ways were constructed in a certain sense. We more easily see now the discourses that we used to have when things change. And here are just a couple of examples. There was need in both Finland and Sweden for ways of speaking that are new, in the sense that there was need to construct rather quickly a new consensus around NATO membership without losing the elements of continuity. So a bit the same as I mentioned with the small state realism thing, that one needs to show confidence in one's own role, and one needs to put NATO in the right spots, that it is great. It has a role in deterrence in particular, while leaving it for Finland to be in charge of its own defense as it sees best. So very importantly, NATO would not be like deciding on how we defend our own country. That would be too much for the general public. You need this kind of way of sort of reparting the roles and showing who is doing what and what is changing and what is continuing. Also pointing out that NATO is not a supranational organization, so it doesn't need, Finland doesn't have to change its foreign and security policies. An element of continuity. Consensus and continuity at the same time. And as I said, we also now see perhaps more clearly some of the interesting ways we used to talk about NATO. One example in Finland was that there was a consensus on the fact that Finland has the option to join when it wants to, but it would be wise to join when the security situation is calm, when there are no problems around. That would be the moment when Finland would take the decision and join NATO. What we now see is that we are joining when there is a war. No one ever thought that would be possible, or that we would come to that kind of situation. We also see that we used to speak about the room for maneuver, in the sense that Finland has room for maneuver because it can decide to join or it can decide not to join. That was the room. Now we say that once Finland is in NATO, it has room for maneuver, because it was felt that this room for maneuver was getting smaller because of the Russian actions. And a final example, we changed discourses about how and why Finland takes part in international cooperation in security and defense. It has been taking part in all kinds of operations, but there was this need to mask this participation in a certain way, to speak about it in a certain way. For instance, in 2014, Finland took part in air policing on Iceland, but it didn't say it is about air policing. It couldn't have to do with defense. It was only about training. And now Finland could do exactly the same, but it wouldn't need to say it is training. It can use the a completely different vocabulary, speaking about defense and security as the other participants would say. But these are examples of ways in which we used to be speaking, and for a reason. But all this is changing. And I think these moments of change are really interesting because we understand much more about ourselves, not only about NATO and our neighbors. So here I would like to stop. I only show to you that I listed readings for you, short reports that come out now on a daily, weekly basis from different organizations, some longer articles, and finally websites for research institutes that might be of interest for you to look at. Many, many thanks. I now look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ojanen. And I might ask you if you don't mind sending those to me Elizabeth Amrian can circulate
Yes.
that list to the attendees.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yes.
I'm sure we have a number of people who are very interested in some of these these links you've curated. So oh, wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. I am so fascinated by so many things that you said, including the discourse discussion at the end. And I'm hoping that maybe some of the students picked up on that and will ask a question. I don't want to take too much of your time because I do want to encourage the students to ask you questions as well. So I'm just signaling to the students that I thought the discourse thing at the end was really interesting. If you're thinking about which thing to ask a question about, you can ask about anything. But I wanted to ask you a question that I thought of right at the beginning of your talk. I was fascinated by and reflecting on that variation in the difference between Finland and Sweden. And I was thinking about just how profound that difference is. And I think about things in a kind of a historical institutionalist way. So I think of existing capabilities as both capabilities or constraints. They're constraints when you start trying to do something different. They require reform or a renewal or new strategies and changing interests and changing all these things. And it's a big deal. And so I was thinking about whether Sweden has a less territorial defense, higher capabilities, and more security of supply, because it has more domestic defense industries that could be re-incentivized towards other weapon systems and things like that. I mean, it's all very difficult, all this change. But it also is very oriented both in its strategy and its capabilities towards expeditionary capabilities. So it's kind of a good NATO member in that way, if you consider NATO out of area operations. And then Finland is, a good NATO member because it's has all such personnel, traditional territorial defense capabilities. And so I'm just kind of wondering what you see the biggest challenges for each state in terms of reforming their existing both capabilities, defense, industrial base. It seems like Finland's largest challenges might be moving towards collective systems or new things like missile defense or things like that in an interoperable way. Whereas Sweden's challenges would be to be more like Finland in terms of this. And I mean, I understand that there are divisions of labor, but it just really interested me that variation. And I just really wanted to ask you what you saw as the biggest reform challenge for each member.
This is really a very good question. And you really well also underlined the differences between the two. So the two are coming to this from like rather different starting points, but what both face is the challenge of increasing defense spending. It's a challenge in the sense that it needs to be a long-term increase. Now, on a short term, it's not a problem because everyone is in favor, basically, of increasing the defense budget. So just now, we can't see any problems. The two countries are just promising more and buying more and producing more. But what about the long term? Then again, we don't really know what is needed in the long term, whether this emphasis on territorial defense will stay, or whether things will become calm again, and whether that the out-of-area operations will increase. Now they have been decreasing for various reasons. But it might well be that there is need for operations abroad. And then while Sweden would now be more sort of suited for that, Finland is currently buying a large number of new F35s, which could be used anywhere, which might be one of the ways it could sort of have more input, internationally speaking. So I'd say defense spending is the concrete challenge, and the rest depends really on the collective decision on what are the priorities.
Fantastic. I have one Q&A question I'll be getting to in a moment from a student, but I wanted to follow up on that because I'm fascinated with the F35 program, the international aspects, especially of the F35 program. And I follow Finnish strategic thought, but I'm also just curious, because you'd be the person to ask, about the nature of the discourse around the domestic debate. Do you think it was one of these things that kind of happened quickly behind the scenes a little bit, the decision about the F-35, or can you characterize any more public aspects of the debate around whether it was framed as strategically necessary or more like a, I had a student once in a seminar who called the F-35 a very expensive friendship bracelet with the United States, whether it's more symbolic. I mean, I know it's both, but I'm just really curious about the nuance of that strategic debate.
Yes, thank you. It's a huge deal financially. Can't even remember how much. And it was a long process, and it came to a conclusion last year. So it was before the war, so the war didn't enter. It was anyway, there was already that willingness to spend a lot. And the process was designed in a way to, how to say, to make it as reliable as possible. So there were several options on the table, and a thorough screening of all these options. And finally, one option chosen, where the deal was in all ways the best. Like the contenders, we had Sweden, for instance. Swedish fighters are always a good option. And it, as you now can imagine, having listened to this, there could be good reasons for choosing Swedish ones. But still, this was the choice. And there wasn't that much of a debate. Yes, to some extent, because it is a really large investment. So people might ask, like, why do we need all this? But yeah, a rather thorough process, I should say. And now we see that this decision has been seen very favorably also in this NATO process, like really showing that there is this sort of capability that Finland can bring with it.
Thank you. So we have a student in the Q&A who's going back to the big picture, asking about, I mean, the decision is made, the decision has been made. I mean, it's not, we aren't at a stage of formality yet, but asking kind of back to the big picture, would strategic ambiguity be a better option for these states than NATO membership in terms of especially great power competition or tensions, especially with NATO, Russia, China, that have been developing. So asking about the risk for the countries themselves and for great power competition.
This is really a very nicely formulated question. Strategic ambiguity is a very good notion. It's not something that we have actively been using here. I think the Finnish way of speaking and also the Swedish one have been rather trying to avoid ambiguity, at least in the way you speak, like saying that we are reliable, we are clear, we know what we do, and you can also know what we do, like reciprocity in a sense, that we are not playing a game where like you would get surprises and you wouldn't really know where the countries are at any given moment. So no ambiguity in that sense. Non-alignment might look ambiguous, yes, in the sense that you are not really there, you are not really here, but from our perspective, it would still look like it was rather straightforward, that it is exactly basing your defense on your own capabilities and not being dependent on anyone, and not leaning on any particular direction. Now then, at the same time, when these two countries have been non-aligned, they have increasingly developed their defense cooperation. So clearly you see that they cooperate more and more and more. So it's not, you might ask, like, is this still non-alignment and where the boundaries go? It's a good question, impossible to say, really. But the risks then. And this is also a very important point. As I said, particularly at in very early this year, in February, March, we talked a lot about the risks. And there was a very concrete sense of worry that there might be direct consequences, like every step the political leaders take might lead to some nasty consequences, Russia taking some measures against us that we would not know what they are, not necessarily like attacking us militarily, but causing disturbances in critical infrastructure or starting disinformation campaigns, different kinds of things. So people were really thinking of this and being worried. And this was one of the reasons for why most of us thought that it's good to go as quickly as possible in order to sort of not be in that risk zone. But what then happened was that Russia really didn't react at all. We really don't know, perhaps they tried to do something, but anyway, the official reaction was more or less that, okay, fine, go to NATO. We will see later on if you do something that we don't like once you are in NATO, and then we might react. So that was rather surprising in a sense, but it also took away a lot of that risk thinking. And yeah, but still your question is very relevant, and the risks, they come in different shapes, and there will be new kinds of ways of seeing risks also once the other two countries are in NATO.
I have two excellent questions from students, but I actually wanted to invite you to expand on what you were saying in the last 2 minutes, just a little bit more in a pedagogical way, actually. I have a lot of students in the class who are very skilled at thinking about great power politics and are oriented towards thinking about like the global balances of power and things like that. And who may not have been aware of the discourse in Scandinavia in the spring, because who would expect necessarily everybody to be paying attention to everything? But I just wanted to invite you. You mentioned threats to critical infrastructure and things like that. And I wanted to know if you had any other examples of the kind of perceived threat in Finland and Sweden in the spring of this year. Specifically, what was the nature of the perceived threat? There were conversations around, I think there were some moments when Putin was maybe, or Russia was maybe threatening missile strikes. There was even a movement of troops around the border a little bit at one point. And so I wanted you to just emphasize for a moment what the perceived threats were, rather than this kind of neutral billiard ball view of the world where you're just picking teams amongst great powers. What were the really existential or perceived threats for especially Finland?
Yeah, right. And thank you. The border, that is where we always need to start. And you might think that it is really problematic to have like 1,300 kilometers of border. But surprisingly, it has been a rather calm place, even this year. So there was discussion and of course increased preparedness because of potential risks of two types, really. One would be more sort of military action or movement of troops near the border. This really didn't materialize because all troops were sent to Ukraine. So now there are less forces on our border than what there normally is. At the same time, the Finnish military has always been prepared, so they always check what goes on. So they just continued checking and counting. So it didn't mean that they would need to change something. They were like, they knew what was going on and could anticipate, well, what happens there. But there was also another border-related risk, and that was that Russia could just keep or start sending people to Finland across the border. We had an example of that during the refugee crisis in 2015. We had some 100 or something people coming suddenly over the border from Russia to Lapland in Finland. And that was kind of a test, like, what if Russia just sends a huge number of people? Usually we have always been thinking that Russia actually has an interest in not letting people come over the borders that much. But we suddenly realized that there is a risk for this kind of sort of hybrid action as well, that we haven't seen. Now the border traffic has been minimized, really. And it was rather striking. I remember this spring. I live close to the railway where the trains come from Russia, or used to come. And I remember I was walking close by, and I saw a train that was leaving to St. Petersburg. It was completely empty. And I saw a train coming back. It was full. And that was shortly before all the traffic was cancelled for the time being. So we have a living border in a sense, and with it, the risks, but manageable so far.
So I have three excellent questions, and I'm going to ask you all of them from the students so that you can kind of just weave your way through them. So if you want to take notes or anything. Okay. The last one I'm actually going to ask first, because it's exactly related to what you were just talking about threats. And so it was saying that, you know, there's traditional strength in Finland on territorial defense. And that's really not that much of a concern at this exact moment, as you're saying, because Russia has mobilized in the other direction almost entirely. But the question is about non-traditional risks. And so what kind of preparedness in general has there been, or, you know, new or old, about cybersecurity, disinformation, and threats to infrastructure? Because that probably is pretty central to security concerns. So that would involve some of the hybrid things you're talking about, like movement of people or infrastructure. The next question is about back to kind of general global power. How does Finland and Sweden's application and entry into NATO shift balance of power dynamics in a large sense? What does it mean for the countries that are still neutral? What are the implications for that shrinking group of countries that are still neutral in a certain way or non-aligned? And then one of the students amplified my comment also about this fascinating discourse around NATO membership before and after the Russian invasion. Basically, its commitment to neutrality, some of the discourse, its current relationship with NATO. What are some big shifts? I thought that was fascinating around, I'm just adding on to that, I thought it was fascinating around the military exercise, you know, not being able to call it a military exercise in that way. And so the student invites you just to, are there any other examples of that discourse shift before and after the Russian invasion around NATO? Those are the questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, something to add on these non-traditional threats. I think one thing to add here is what I very shortly mentioned, but I didn't go into any detail, this idea of a whole of society defense or total defense, or however you call it. That is typical in Finland, and that is has been the case in Sweden as well, and they are restarting again, more forcefully building that up. It is an interesting concept that is a bit hard to explain, really. But it's perhaps a couple of examples just shortly. It's a way of somehow weaving the whole society into thinking about what each and everyone's role could be in case of crisis. So it would be like there is a predefined cooperation with private enterprises that are central to critical infrastructure or production or other functions, so that they know they have a almost daily relation with defense. They know what to do in times of crisis. They have a role. So this is like one example of this thinking. So it requires actually regular maintenance. You need to have this sort of society-wide kind of, again, consensus perhaps, thinking that, yes, we might need you, and your role then would be this and that. And I think it has worked well. We haven't been in a major crisis. We hope it will work, but it is, I know, it's a bit different as an approach from many other countries. It also has to do with how the defense forces are related to the general population, because when you have conscription, then you would have some kind of a sort of relation to the armed forces anyway. Your brothers, your husband would know, would have done their conscription. And so you have a sort of a different kind of knowledge about what the armed forces do and how they operate than if you had a professional army, when only like one part of the society is actually involved and in the same sense, like up to date. When it then comes to the other questions, perhaps just something about the balance of power. Shortly, this is really an interesting question, because now we are in a war and it changes constellations very quickly. We have countries condemning Russia. We have some countries in the world that are somehow sitting on the fence and not really knowing where they belong. And this is changing. So we don't really know how the great power balance will be. Russia is losing the game, but what will China do? What will India do? And how the small players then react. And what do the small ones have to say about China? This is really interesting. They might be dependent. They might not want to criticize. So these are the sort of post-war considerations. Of course, we have them already now, but that will be on the table then again. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this excellent tour of both in-depth analysis about Finland and Sweden, but also a lot of the implications that the students are really thinking about. I have students who are experts on the Middle East or the Indo-Pacific or the East Asia, and they're fascinated about these kinds of questions in relation to European security. And so thank you so much for engaging with them on this and for your excellent talk and your excellent answers.